You're standing in a low mud brick room on the west bank of the Nile, and the first thing that hits you is the smell. It's not the one you brace for. You expect decay, and it's there, somewhere far underneath, but it's drowned beneath waves of myrrh and cedar resin and something sharp and mineral that dries the back of your throat when you breathe in. That last one is natron. You're going to get to know natron very well. The heat comes through the doorway in a solid slab. Flies move in slow, lazy circles, and out past the reeds you can hear the river doing what the river always does, completely indifferent to everything happening in here. On a sloped stone table in front of you lies a man. He died 4 days ago. And a figure is leaning over him wearing the black jackal mask of Anubis, holding a thin bronze hook, and he is about to insert it, very carefully, up the man's nose. There is no paperwork. Nobody has signed a release form. There's no next of kin in a waiting room, no soft music, no one making small talk about the weather. There is just this man, this table, 70 days of work stretching out ahead, and a promise that reaches all the way past the edge of the world. And you're standing there thinking the obvious thing. What exactly are they doing to him? And why would anyone go to all this trouble? Now, before we go any further, let's be clear about what this is not. This is not the story of golden masks and boy kings. It's not Howard Carter squinting into Tutankhamun's tomb by candlelight, whispering about wonderful things. It's not the pyramids, not the pharaohs, not the tourist poster version of Egypt you got in a textbook with a photo of a sarcophagus and a caption that explained absolutely nothing. This is the story of the body, the plain human body. What they did to it after the heart stopped, step by uncomfortable step. And the answer is stranger, more industrial, and frankly more disturbing than anyone taught you in school. So, let's start with what we actually know. Egyptians did not wake up one morning and invent mummification. It crept up on them over thousands of years, and it started by accident. Go back to before the pyramids, before the pharaohs, before writing itself, to a place called Hierakonpolis around 3500 BCE. People there buried their dead in shallow pits in the desert, wrapped in reed mats, laid on their sides, and the desert did something the living hadn't planned for. The hot, dry sand pulled every drop of moisture out of the bodies before they could rot. It preserved them. Skin, hair, the works. You can go and look one of these people in the face right now. There's a naturally dried man from this era in the British Museum, thousands of years old, curled up exactly as he was buried, skin like leather stretched over his bones. And here's what nobody tells you. The Egyptians noticed. They dug, for whatever reason, and they found their ancestors still recognizable, still there, staring back out of the sand. And somewhere in that moment, a genuinely enormous idea was born. The body doesn't have to end, it can be kept. And if it can be kept, then maybe the person can be kept too. The problem was that Egyptian society got richer and grander, and the rich stopped wanting to be dumped in a sandy pit. They wanted tombs, stone chambers, coffins, grave goods. And the second you put a body inside a nice sealed stone box away from that magical drying sand, it does the ordinary thing that bodies do. It decomposes horribly. So they had a puzzle. How do you get the desert's preservation without the desert? The answer took centuries of trial and grim error, and by the height of the New Kingdom, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, the age of the Valley of the Kings, of Deir el Medina, of the tombs everyone thinks of, they had it down to a system. A professional, repeatable, 70-day system. And it went like this. We know a lot of the details from a foreign tourist. His name was Herodotus, a Greek writer who visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE and wrote it all down in Book 2 of his histories. Now, a warning. Herodotus is a visitor, not an Egyptologist, and he loved a good story. Archaeology has caught him exaggerating more than once. But on the basic outline of embalming, when we compare his account to the actual bodies on the table and to the work of modern experts like Salima Ikram, who has spent her career reconstructing exactly how this was done, he holds up remarkably well. So, back to our man on the table and the bronze hook going up his nose. They started with the brain. And what they did to it tells you almost everything about how these people saw a human being. They pushed a hooked instrument up through the nostril, broke through the thin bone behind it, and went to work on the brain itself, whisking it, liquefying it, and letting it drain out of the nose. In some cases, they poured in resin to dissolve what was left, and then they threw it away. Read that again. The brain, the organ you and I consider the seat of the self, the place where you live, the thing reading these words right now, the Egyptians scooped it out and discarded it like kitchen waste. It was garbage to them. It served no purpose they could see. Then they turned to the torso. A cut was made along the left flank, and in went the embalmer's hand to remove the organs. The lungs, the liver, the stomach, the intestines. These four were not thrown away. They were far too important. Each was washed, dried, and stored in its own special container, what we call a canopic jar, and each jar was guarded by one of the four sons of the god Horus. The liver watched over by a human-headed guardian, the lungs by a baboon, the stomach by a jackal, the intestines by a falcon. Four jars, four gods, standing eternal watch over your guts. But one organ they left exactly where it was: the heart. Because to an Egyptian, the heart was not a pump. The heart was you. It was the seat of thought, of memory, of personality, of everything the brain does in our understanding. The mind lived in the chest. And the heart could not be removed because the heart had a job to do after death, the single most important appointment the person would ever keep. We'll come back to that appointment. It's terrifying. First, the salt. Now that the body was hollowed out, they had to solve the original problem: the water. A human body is mostly water, and water is what lets things rot. So they packed the man, inside and out, in natron, that mineral salt from the dry lake beds, and they buried him in it completely, and they left him for around 40 days. 40 days, while the natron did exactly what the desert sand had done for those ancient bodies at Hierakonpolis, just faster and under control. It drew out every trace of moisture until what remained was dry, shrunken, and stable, preserved, incapable of decay. Then came the finishing work. They washed him, anointed him with oils and fragrant resins, sometimes packed the sunken places with linen or sawdust to restore a lifelike shape, and then began the wrapping. Layer upon layer of linen, hundreds of yards of it, wound around every limb, every finger. And tucked between those layers, in precise positions, went the amulets. Protective charms, each one placed exactly where the sacred texts said it should go, each one activating a specific spell of magical protection for the journey ahead. And those spells came from somewhere. And this is one of the most fascinating things about Egyptian death that almost nobody knows. In the age of the pyramids, the Old Kingdom, the spells that guided you through the afterlife were carved on the walls inside royal pyramids. We call them the pyramid texts, and they are the oldest religious writings on earth. And they were for the king, only the king. The pharaoh had an afterlife. Ordinary people, not so much. But over the centuries, that changed. In the Middle Kingdom, the spells migrated onto the coffins of nobles, the coffin texts, and the door to eternity cracked open a little wider. And by the New Kingdom, they'd been gathered into what we now call the Book of the Dead, written on papyrus, that anyone who could afford a copy could be buried with. Eternity, slowly, was being democratized. It went from a royal privilege to something a well-off commoner could buy, one spell at a time. And there was one last thing to do, at the very end, on the day of burial. Outside the tomb, the wrapped body was stood upright, and a priest approached, holding a small ceremonial blade shaped like an adze, and touched it to the mummy's mouth. This was the opening of the mouth, a ritual to magically switch the senses back on to let the dead breathe again, speak again, eat and drink again on the other side. Because a preserved body was only a vessel, this was the ceremony meant to turn it back into a person. The whole thing, start to finish, death to burial, took about 70 days. 70 days. Longer than most people today will spend planning a wedding. All of it lavished on someone who was, by every measure you and I would use, already gone. And we are not guessing at most of this. We have the bodies. Modern teams, including the DNA and CT scanning studies of the royal mummies, led by Zahi Hawass, have slid these people into medical scanners and read them like documents. You can see the resin sitting in their skulls where the brain used to be. You can see the embalmer's incisions, the amulets still tucked into the wrappings, healed fractures, worn down teeth, the diseases they carried, and sometimes the very thing that killed them. Teams have even reconstructed the royal family tree worked out, who fathered whom among the pharaohs from the genetic code of people 3,000 years dead. The dead of Egypt are still, quietly, giving their testimony. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking this is madness. You're thinking these were primitive, superstitious people who didn't understand death, wasting months of skilled labor pickling corpses because they didn't know any better. Stop, because that's exactly the trap. Here's the thing. To an ancient Egyptian, none of this was superstition. It was logistics. Cold, rational, forward planning logistics for a problem they took as seriously as you take a mortgage. They believed a person was made of several parts. There was the ba, roughly your personality, which could move about after death. There was the ka, your life force, which needed somewhere to return to and to be sustained. And here is the crucial part. Those pieces of you needed the body as an anchor, a home base. Destroy the body, let it rot away to nothing, and the Ka and Ba had nowhere to land. The person would be, in the fullest and most permanent sense, erased. So, when you look at it through their eyes, 70 days of embalming isn't insane at all. It's insurance. It's the most important construction project of your entire existence. And the structure you're building is your own eternity. Skimping on it would be the truly irrational choice. Suddenly, the priest in the jackal mask isn't a superstitious fool. He's a specialist performing a highly technical procedure with the stakes set at forever. Once you understand that, everything they did makes a strange and rigorous kind of sense. And now for the part that makes a lot less comfortable sense. Because here's what really happened when you strip away the incense and the prayers. This was a business. Mummification wasn't some sacred rite performed for free by devoted priests. It was an industry, with workshops, with staff, with a price list. And Herodotus tells us there were tiers. 3 of them, like a menu. At the top, the full luxury package. The works, the brain, the organs, the resins, the best of everything. In the middle, a cheaper option where instead of the careful removal of organs, embalmers injected oils into the body to dissolve the insides, then drain them out, cutting the labor and the cost. And, at the bottom, the budget version for the poor. A simple purge, a rush through the natron, and done. Think about that for a second. Your shot at eternity depended on your bank balance. The rich got a first-class ticket into the afterlife. The poor got economy, packed in salt and sent on their way. Even in death, especially in death, Egypt was a society of the haves and the have-nots. And it gets darker. And here I have to flag Herodotus again, because this is his claim and archaeology can't confirm it. He reports that the bodies of beautiful women and the wives of important men were not handed over to the embalmers right away. They were held back for 3 or 4 days first. Why? Because, he says, an embalmer had once been caught interfering with the body of a woman in his care. So the delay existed to let decomposition begin, to make the corpse a less tempting object. Whether or not that specific horror was as common as Herodotus implies, and we should hold his lurid stories at arm's length, the very existence of the claim tells you something. This was work, done by human beings, around death, all day, every day, and human beings are human beings. Now, if you think mummifying people was a big operation, wait until you hear about the animals. Across Egypt, and especially in the vast underground catacombs at Saqqara, archaeologists have found mummified animals, not in the hundreds, not in the thousands, but in the millions. Cats, dogs, birds, crocodiles. Above all, ibises, long-beaked wading birds sacred to Thoth, the god of wisdom. Row after row after row of them, wrapped and stacked in the dark. These weren't beloved pets sent off with their owners. They were votive offerings. You wanted to send a prayer to a god, so you bought a mummified animal sacred to that god and had it deposited in the catacomb on your behalf. A physical prayer. And where there's mass demand, there's mass production. There is strong evidence that animals were being bred in enormous numbers, specifically to be killed young and turned into these offerings. An entire economy of manufactured sacred creatures. And here's the detail that turns it from strange to genuinely modern. When researchers like Salima Ikram and her team put these animal bundles through scanners, expecting to find a neat little mummified ibis inside each one, they didn't always find one. Some bundles held a complete animal, yes, but others held only part of an animal, just a few bones, a clump of feathers. And some held nothing at all, just mud or reeds, wrapped up to look like the real thing. Fake mummies, sold to worshippers who never knew. An ancient devotional industry with an ancient counterfeiting problem baked right in. And then there's the final, strangest fate of all, the one that happened to the human mummies long, long after Egypt itself was gone. Because those carefully preserved bodies, sealed in their tombs for eternity, did not get to rest. Starting in the medieval period and running for centuries, Europeans developed a bizarre belief that ground up mummy was medicine. They called it mumia. Powdered dead Egyptian, sold in apothecaries, swallowed as a cure for bruises, bleeding, headaches, all sorts. Demand grew so high that the supply of genuine ancient mummies ran short, and there are grim accounts of more recent bodies being dried and passed off as the ancient article. And later still, in the eager, ghoulish Victorian era, unwrapping a real Egyptian mummy became a form of parlor entertainment, a party where guests gathered to watch a human being who had been prepared with unimaginable care for the next life get peeled apart for an evening's amusement. 70 days of devotion, and it ended as a party trick or a spoonful of medicine. Now, let me tell you about that appointment, the one the heart had to keep. Because to understand any of this, you have to understand what these people were so afraid of. They believed that after death, you traveled to a great hall, and there, before the god Osiris and a panel of divine judges, your heart, the heart they'd so carefully left inside your chest, was placed on one side of a great scale. On the other side sat a single feather, the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and cosmic order. And your heart was weighed against it. If you had lived a good and balanced life, your heart was light, and the scales held even, and you passed on into eternity. But if your heart was heavy, weighed down with cruelty, with lies, with wrong done and never made right, then the scale tipped. And crouched beside it, waiting, was a creature the Egyptians called the devourer, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. She ate the hearts that failed. And to have your heart eaten was not simply to be denied paradise, it was to be destroyed, annihilated, to die a second death, the final one, and cease to exist in every world at once. Total erasure. The Egyptians were so afraid of this moment that they hedged. Among the wrapped up amulets, over the heart, they placed a special carved scarab inscribed with a spell, and the spell was a plea, addressed to the person's own heart. It begged the heart not to speak up, not to betray its owner, not to testify against him in that hall and tip the scale. Think about what that means. They were so frightened of judgment that they wrapped their dead with a magic charm whose entire purpose was to ask their own heart, please, keep quiet about what you know. And this is the part where I want you to set the jokes aside, because there's something here worth sitting with. Strip all of it away, the natron, the jars, the scanners, the powder, the party tricks, and look at what's actually underneath. Underneath is a person who was loved. That man on the table had a name. He had people who knew the sound of his voice, who would notice the next morning that he wasn't there. Somewhere in the cemeteries of Egypt lie mothers and fathers, and a heartbreaking number of children, because in a world with no medicine as we know it, children died constantly, and each small body was wrapped with the same aching care as any king. We know this from the excavation of ordinary graves at places like Amarna, quiet, unglamorous evidence of grief, on a scale it's hard to hold in your head. And here is what that whole 70-day machine was really for. It was not about corpses, it was about the terror of being forgotten. The single deepest fear these people had was not pain, or even death, it was erasure. Vanishing so completely that no trace of you remained, and no one ever said your name again. They believed, with total sincerity, that to speak the name of the dead was to make them live once more. So they built tombs covered in names. They carved inscriptions begging the passerby to read them aloud. They spent months preserving a body so that the person would have somewhere to exist and someone, someday, to remember them. And here you are. Thousands of years later, on the other side of the planet, in a world they could not have dreamt of, thinking about that man on the table, wondering about his heart and his name and the people who wept for him. In the only way that ever really mattered to them, it worked. So come back to that room one last time. The heat, the flies moving in their slow circles, the natron burning the back of your throat, the masked figure bent over the table, doing his careful, unhurried work, because there is no rushing eternity. Outside, the river keeps moving, indifferent as ever. And somewhere far ahead of that man, past all the salt and linen and prayer, is you. Because you will be a body someday too. Someone will have to decide what to do with you. And whatever they choose, fire, earth, salt, or something not yet invented, it will be their answer to the exact same question these people were answering on that table by the Nile. The Egyptians gave the most extravagant answer anyone has ever given. They looked death in the face, and they said, "Not entirely. Not if we can help it. Not if there's still someone left to say your name. So I'll say his. Whoever you were, on that table, 4 days gone, you were here,